Welcome to the latest episode of Getting to Know Jew from the Kansas City Jewish Chronicle. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, your host this week, and I am incredibly excited and honored to talk to Jason Kander, a Kansas City native and former Missouri Secretary of State turned veteran advocate with the creation of the Veterans Community Project. He is also a best-selling author with his second book, Invisible Storm, A Soldier's Memoir of Politics and PTSD, coming out in July. Jason, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Great intro. The only correction I will make is a lot of people they are under the impression that I started Veterans Community Project, and I'm always careful to point out that I didn't. I just came along and, made a lot of noise about it. And so I like to joke that I'm like, if Ray Kroc and the McDonald brothers had maintained a good relationship, the guy who came along and people think founded McDonald's, but didn't, that's me with Veterans Community Project. So I'm in charge of expanding it nationally, but it was created by very inventive people before I came along. But thank you for the intro.
Oh, thank you. You've done so much more. And if I had said everything in the intro that you've done, that would kill our time.
I appreciate it.
So let's talk about the VCP. What was it that led you to get involved and help elevate it to this level where it's now expanding to states outside of the Kansas City area?
Well, for me, I was running for mayor in 2018, and I was also, as is pretty well known at this point, not doing so well personally. I was, suffering from undiagnosed, untreated PTSD and had been for about a decade at that point and had not gone to get treatment or anything. But I was running for mayor and it was going well, and we were going to win probably by a pretty good margin. The race was going very well, but I was not, I had one good day personally on that campaign. And it was the day that I toured Veterans Community Project. It was in August of 2018. I toured the place and I was just like knocked over by the vibe. I describe it as like if a forward operating base in Afghanistan and a startup in Silicon Valley had a baby, like really innovative, but really dark humor. And just creative and getting things done. It's run by my fellow combat veterans who, are out to achieve things for veterans in the Kansas City community, both through an outreach operation that serves all veterans with any possible need and through a residential operation that serves homeless veterans and transitions them into permanent housing. So I was really knocked over by it. And I went home that night and I told my wife, boy, I wish I could just quit everything I'm doing and go work there. But I didn't really wholly mean that because I was a politician. I was in a campaign and that's what I thought I was. And didn't really think much more than that. And then didn't think about it again for a little bit. And then about 6 weeks after that, I dropped out of everything. My symptoms had gotten bad enough where, I was having more frequent suicidal thoughts and that kind of thing. And so I went to the VA to get help. And they told me that it was going to be 5 or 6 months before I could get enrolled in the system and therefore start therapy for PTSD at the VA. And I wasn't sure what to do at that point. And it was the day before I announced that I was going to drop out of everything and make public that I suffered from PTSD. So I called Brian Meyer, one of the co-founders of Veterans Community Project, who was also a friend of mine. And I was like, what do I do? And he said, why don't you come on down here? So 6 weeks after getting the VIP, you're going to be mayor tour, I went through the front doors of the outreach center, like thousands of other vets in Kansas City. They handled my paperwork for me, expedited the process at the VA. And about a week later, I was starting therapy at the VA. And so that made a huge difference in my life, obviously. And so I started hanging around the place. And, once I was doing a lot better in therapy and everything, and Brian and his co-founders were trying to figure out how they answer the call from these communities all over the country that were saying, hey, we love what you've done in Kansas City. Would you ever consider coming here and expanding? And they had started to try it a little bit, and they were having some stops and starts with it. And I had created a national organization before called Let America Vote. And so Brian said, hey, why don't you just, because I was kind of mentoring him through that. And he said, why don't you just come here and help us full time? So that's how I became the president of National Expansion. And since then, we've been expanding into the Denver area, to St. Louis, to Sioux Falls, to Oklahoma City. And then we have others coming after that.
I mean, it really is an amazing project. I, did a deep dive in the website, and it really is just so phenomenal what the organization does. I'm really interested. You talked about your PTSD. You've been very public about it. And the new book you've written is obviously, it's in the title, it's going to cover that. Why did you make the decision to be so public about the PTSD and the struggles that you had? It could have been strictly a family issue, but you've decided to talk way more openly about it.
a couple of reasons. I mean, first, what forced the decision was I had first decided that I wasn't going to try to get treatment while continuing to run for mayor, because it had been so long, over a decade, that, it's kind of like, I like to compare it to like a physical injury. So, before I went into the Army, I hurt my knee. I had to get surgery on my knee, and I had to get physical therapy and rehab the knee in order to get a physical waiver in order to enlist. And I compare it to, what if instead of doing that physical therapy and that surgery, I had just been like, I'll just tough it out, and I'm going to ignore this knee injury, but I'm going to go into the Army and I'm going to do all the physical stuff. Well, after 10 years, like, I wouldn't be able to walk. Like, it would be,
right.
it would be mangled, right? Well, this was no different. My trauma was what it was. There are obviously folks who have had more traumatic experiences and have had PTSD that probably would have been naturally worse. But by putting off treatment for over 10 years, by the time I was making the decision to treat it, I knew that the only way I was going to be able to do it effectively was to stop, trying to distract myself with other things and to just focus on it. So once I decided that, it was like, okay, well, I could just say, yeah, I want to spend more time with my family or whatever. But instead, I just thought, one, I think it'll help me to be public about it. I've been hiding it from myself for so long, and therefore also hiding my symptoms and everything from everybody else around me. I felt like if I could just be my more authentic self, it might make healing a little bit easier. I knew that there would be challenges that come with that, like obviously opening yourself up and having everybody know about something that, about your mental health comes with its own issues. But then the second part, and what really put me over the edge about it, was I wanted something good to come of it. And I felt like, if somebody in a public position like mine had done that 10 years earlier, maybe I would have gone and gotten treatment 10 years earlier, and maybe I wouldn't have been in the situation that I was in. And so I just kind of felt an obligation to do that and to help, reduce the stigma. And I figured maybe some other people will get help if I did. And fortunately, gratifyingly, I've just heard from thousands of people over the last few years who have told me that that's what prompted them to decide to go and get help, both veterans and non-veterans.
Obviously, you mentioned the VA. In your initial attempt at seeking help was going to be a many-month process. People who are suffering in that way can't always wait that long. Do you have a proposal for how to expedite the process to make that easier?
The good news is, I'm glad you asked, because I sometimes forget to make this clear for any veteran that's listening. The good news is that they have addressed that since. So, this was over 3 years ago now, but in the meantime, they did change some rules, at least on the mental health side, to make it so that they'll start treating you, and when it comes to mental health, while adjudicating your benefits claim. Whereas, at that point, there are still plenty, don't get me wrong, there's still plenty of issues, and there are still plenty of gaps in the system that people fall through, but they've at least remedied that one. I wish it were better known that they had, but they've remedied that one. And then the other one that affected me at the time that they have since changed was they had, and there's a lot of dumb rules with the VA, and it's not the fault of the people at the VA. It's the fault of, people in Washington, mostly in Congress over the years who have come up with a far too narrow system. Everybody at the VA that from clinicians to call center people, to a person, it's the best customer service experience I've ever had. Everybody clearly takes a lot of pride in what they do. But the other issue that I ran into at the time, which is no longer the case, was they had a rule that said that if you come in within 5 years of your combat deployment, then, they'd enroll you in the system, and there wasn't going to be a whole prove it sort of situation. The problem with that, among many problems, obviously, was trauma doesn't get better with time, So this had been over 10 years since my deployment. And now I was in this position of having to prove this thing that I had spent the last 10 years trying to convince myself didn't exist. And so that's primarily where I needed the help of Veterans Community Project.
And that's one of those things, the invisible scars, the invisible illnesses that come with, mental health challenges, whether you're a soldier or not.
Mm-hmm, sure. Yeah. I mean, that's exactly right. And we have a tendency, all humans have a tendency to try to rank our trauma out of existence by, and there's nothing wrong with trying to gain perspective by thinking about, the suffering of others compared to yours, but it can go too far. It can go to a point where you deny to yourself that you have any right to whatever it is that you're struggling with. And that's what I did.
One of the things with Veterans Community Project, in terms of Jewish values, is very much in the mold of tikkun olam and tzedakah in a lot of ways. Were those the kind of Jewish values that were important in your home growing up? And how do you and Diana sort of try to instill those values in your kids now and in your home?
Yes, they were important, but it was rarely ever explained to me as a Jewish value growing up. And I'll explain why. I come from a mixed family. And frankly, like the Kanders were Jewish, but, like my cousin likes to joke that we're Jew-ish. Like we're very culturally Jewish, right? But growing up, I went to temple for weddings and funerals. I think I may have been to a high holy day a couple of times as a kid. But I grew up my parents took a job out just in the suburbs of Kansas City before I was born. So my family, like my kids are sixth generation KC but I spent a lot of my upbringing in the western suburbs out in Johnson County and Shawnee. And so I was the only Jewish person I knew, and my dad and my my family. I didn't know any Jews who I wasn't related to, and my parents took in these kids who we refer to as like my unofficial foster brothers. They're just my brothers, in addition to my younger brother who's adopted, and they were Catholic, my foster brothers. So I wanted to go to school with my brothers, so I went to Catholic high school. So I think I've now, as an adult, been to enough Jewish services that I may have equaled the Catholic masses that I've been to in my life. But so that, and then my mom was adopted, so doesn't know her lineage, didn't know her lineage and wasn't raised Jewish. But I didn't know, here's the other factor. Other than my mom's brother who lived in Kansas City and a few relatives I kind of met over the years back in Indiana, I didn't really know anybody on my mom's side. So to me, other than my mom and my one uncle, everybody in my family was Jewish, but then the other kids in the house weren't. But my grandparents were one of the founding families of New Reformed Temple. So it was but that said, yeah, all the values I was raised with, I as I got older and, went to school on the East Coast and got more into my own Jewish identity, I realized, I was raised with Jewish values. I mean, my parents they met as juvenile probation officers, and I was just, and then there were kids that they took in my house. So I was raised with, look, you want to make the world a better place. And so I guess the answer to your question is that as I've gotten older, and my wife is Jewish. In fact, my wife came to the United States as a refugee from the Soviet Union at the age of 8, came through a program at Jewish Family Services that was put in place in part by my grandfather when he was president of it. So obviously being Jewish is a big part of our identity as a family. And the way we teach it to our son, and we'll teach it to our daughter as she gets older, is it's just little stuff. Like the other day, Drew and I were at the Jewish Community Center. He does a baseball camp there in the winter. And as we were leaving, he was like, Dad, why is there a Jewish community center? And my friends who aren't Jewish also go here. And so I explained, they didn't used to allow Jews to be a part of, and he, he's familiar with segregation. We went to the Negro Leagues Museum recently and stuff like that. And I explained they didn't used to allow, our family to live in certain neighborhoods, our family to be part of certain clubs. So this started, and then the Jewish values part was, but because we're Jews, we didn't limit it to just other Jews. We wanted anybody initially who wasn't able to be a part of these other clubs to be a part of it. And now we have anybody in at all. So that's the kind of way that we try to teach that sort of stuff to him, I think.
The idea of sort of Jew-ish, as your cousin referred to it, I think that is something that's, if you look at community study after community study, that is so much of, I think, what American Judaism is becoming, is the ish part of it.
We're a highly assimilated bunch, particularly here in the Midwest, right? I mean, my family is Reform. And I remember my dad, I guess when I was 11, I met another Jewish person that I saw much, which was my dad had a administrative assistant in his office, a woman named Shirley, who was one of my favorite people who was Jewish, but she was either conservative or Orthodox, I don't remember. And I remember at one point she came along with my dad to services at New Reform Temple. And I think she left and she said something like, I mean, you have stained glass and a choir, like, why don't I just go to like a Baptist service? You know, she was like really bothered by it, which I always thought was really funny. But but for the most part, you know, and particularly like my family, we've been here in Kansas City a long time. Like I said, I'm fifth generation here. I often joke that in order to marry a local Jewish girl, just to make sure we weren't related, I married an immigrant. So, because I mean, like, you know, I've learned over time, like I am second, third, fourth cousins with like most of the Jews in town, I think. So,
oh, that's wild. And I asked this because I follow you on Twitter and I really enjoy the true stories. Is the JCC baseball clinic, is that where he's learning the 2-seam and the 4-seam?
No.
Or are you teaching him that?
Actually, so I coach his little league team. And I've coached him in most everything in baseball. And he's very generous, and he's 8 years old. He's very generous in telling me that he prefers it when I coach him and all that. But we actually, a friend of mine, Jamie Bluma, is a former pitcher for the Royals and he does pitching lessons. And True starts kid pitch next year. And I've tried really hard to avoid the whole culture of like individual coaching and individual lessons that's become like, for one, expensive. And two, I just think nuts. But Drew's really into baseball and he wants to pitch. And I know Jamie, and he's an awesome teacher and he's great with these kids. And so, so I was like, and Drew also was like, you know, when he was like, I like it when you coach me. And I was like, well, my friend was a Royal. And he's like, yeah, that he can coach me. And so we go to Jamie and he hangs on every word that Jamie says. So, I
mean, I remember when I was 8, if you put a Detroit Tiger in front of me to teach me how to do something, I'd be locked in.
Yeah. When I was setting up his first lesson, Jamie texted me. Jamie was just coming back from Royals fantasy camp, and he sent me a photo of like a group photo of the Royals alums that were at fantasy camp. And I have, True knows the current team, but he is steeped in Royals history because I just talk about it a lot. So we're going through the picture and I'm like, that's Willie Wilson. That's Alex Gordon. That's, you know, and then I'm like, and see, that's Jamie. And he's like, yeah. And I go, and who's that guy next to him wearing number 5, which is, you know, True wears number 5. He's never met George Brett, but like, and he's never obviously seen George Brett play. He's his grandfather's age, but he was like, is that him next to George Brett? And I'm like, yeah. And True like fake fainted, you know? So like, so it's, he hangs on every word of the former Royal who, you know, knows George Brett.
That's phenomenal. All right, we could do
I turn every podcast interview into a baseball conversation. I don't know if you were warned, but
I wasn't. But you know what? I could go really deep in the baseball talk because there's a bit of a rivalry between those mid '80s Tigers and Royals teams. So those were some good. I mean, the '84 league championship series was.
Well, I mean, there was
Tigers beat the Royals, so.
Well, there was a rivalry, you know, in like 2013-14 too. Yep. But it was because it was just at the end of that streak of that incredible Tigers team that never got it done. But that team was just ridiculous.
Just eats at me. That Verlander and Scherzer and
he had Torrey Hunter and that was just getting Kinsler and.
Yep.
Man,
and that was what Casey
Cabrera,
was on,
of course.
Of course, and Casey was on the rise then. It was
and it
good
was
time to be a Midwest baseball fan.
It was so serious that I remember at that time, you know, they do the seventh inning song at that time was "Don't Stop Believing." No, not "Don't Stop Believing." What's the song? Is it "Don't Stop Believing"? Where it has the line about you know, from South Detroit.
Oh yeah, born and raised in South Detroit. Yeah, "Don't Stop Believing."
Yeah. And I remember they had to change the lyrics, and like on the screen, it was like an instruction of what to change. It was like something "born and raised to beat Detroit" or something like that.
Oh, very nice. That's clever.
Yeah. So,
that's good. That's good.
Yeah. So Detroit in like 12 and 13 was not aware that they were in a rivalry with us, but we were very focused on it.
Well, because I mean, at that point, we were sort of the bully. Like, I get it.
Absolutely.
Everybody's coming at us. I get that.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah.
All right. So okay. Yeah. Before we get this way too far afield, you mentioned starting Let America Vote, which started in 2017 after your run against Roy Blunt for the U.S. Senate seat. Let America Vote feels like sort of a natural extension of what you did as Secretary of State in Missouri in terms of getting as many people possible registered to vote. Did you sort of, because you've got that experience as Secretary of State and working so closely in the legislature and with the legislature, did you see coming what we're now seeing in terms of the kind of voter suppression waves that, 6 years ago, maybe as many people weren't attuned to?
Yeah, I did, unfortunately. So the way it happened for me was that, and it's hard to remember now, but if you go back to 2016, prior to the election, and if you think about the political environment that we were in, we were actually on the precipice of really roundly defeating the voter suppression movement. Because of the makeup of the courts at that time, the attempts at voter suppression laws like photo ID were mostly getting struck down all over the place. And on top of that, the legislatures that were trying to get them done were kind of punching themselves out. And so legally, that's where it was. We thought we were on the precipice of having, a Democratic president who was going to then appoint a more progressive Supreme Court justice. So it really looked like that's where things were going. And I think that's what the conservative movement thought as well. Now, what had never happened up to that point was the battle over voting rights in the modern era had never been a political battle. It had exclusively been a legal battle. And we had fought both in Missouri. And what I had done that was a little bit different was, as Secretary of State, I had gone on the offense politically and actually made the argument against photo ID. The conventional wisdom at that time, it's hard to remember now because voter suppression is part of the lexicon, and we've been having these battles over voting rights for the last 6 years. But at the time, it wasn't something people were aware of. I mean, you had to be A, a progressive, and B, pretty deeply politically involved to even be aware of this fight. At the time, requiring photo identification in order to vote, not just in Missouri, but around the country, polled above 70% among Democrats because people just weren't aware of the issue and they didn't understand what the motivations behind it were. They just thought, oh, okay. They had no idea that it was nefarious. So when I ran for Secretary of State in 2012 and I had voted against all of the photo ID laws, that was obviously what my opponent in the race was going to come after me on. And my opponent had sponsored a bill about it. It was considered by many, I think, a really dumb strategy when I ran my ads specifically talking about why I opposed photo ID. But what I did that nobody had really tried was I actually went out and I made the argument and I educated people on it and I told them why I believed what I believed. And then we won the election. And so I carried that through my term as Secretary of State. And every time they tried to do it, I went out and I went on offense. I'd go on national TV. I'd go on every local TV. I'd talk to every editorial board. And I didn't shy away from the issue like most people thought I should. And so now 2016 happens. Trump wins the presidency. And what's one of the first things he does, despite the fact that he won? He goes and says that the election was rigged in New Hampshire because he narrowly lost there. And he says that it was rigged all over the place because he didn't win the popular vote. So really, he did win the popular vote, he says, but it was just because of fraud. So what I could see there was that this Republican strategy that had been taking place in states across the country was now going to be run out of the White House and it was going to be put on steroids. And that was really scary to me. And so while there was a great infrastructure in place for the legal fight against photo ID, I could see that the legal fight was no longer going to be sufficient because you were going to have a judiciary that was going to look a lot different. And I knew from my experience, mine and my chief of staff / campaign manager, Abe Rakove, we knew that you could actually make a political argument against it. So Let America Vote was founded in 2017 to do something that hadn't been done before, which was to win the political battle, the public opinion, the court of public opinion battle over it. And the way we did that was quite unique, was we created political consequences for voter suppression. But the way it traditionally worked and works is somebody, let's say a state senator, usually in a very safe seat, files a photo identification law or a bill against absentee voting or whatever. They file it, it passes, it goes to court, and it takes like a year at least to resolve that litigation. And by the time that's happened, nobody remembers who filed it, and most people have moved on. They don't remember who filed it. They don't remember who voted for it. They don't remember who the governor was who signed it. They don't think about that. And so there are no political consequences for it whatsoever. And so it was a consequence-free environment. And we realized that if we were ultimately, given that we weren't going to have the courts on our side the way we had, that if we were going to win any of these battles, we had to create political consequences. So I also at that time had the advantage of having come off this race where, people had paid a lot of attention, in January, like the day before he left office in January of 2017, President Obama gave his last interview as president, and they asked him who gives you hope for the future? And I was the first name he mentioned. So I had, I was fortunate and I had all this juice at that moment. And it was like a few weeks later that we started Let America Vote, and we're able to benefit from that sort of energy that existed in the Democratic Party nationally at that moment. That was like, what's Jason Kander going to do, right? And so when the answer was Let America Vote, we benefited from a ton of volunteers all over the country and interns, and so we ended up creating this political army in several states. Where we focused on going and finding the legislators and the statewide officials who were most responsible for voter suppression laws and defeating them. And we did it not by having to always go and necessarily convince people to care about voter suppression. I mean, like races in Northern Virginia where we beat people who had voted for voter suppression laws by talking about how bad their record was on minimum wage or on traffic congestion. But the important thing was the legislators knew that if you voted the wrong way on voter suppression and on voting rights, then there was a good chance that a bunch of kids from all over the country were going to move into your district for a few months and knock on every door and convince people to vote against you. So it was very effective in that way. And now it is merged with another major organization called End Citizens United. So it's Let America Vote, End Citizens United. And together, it's the largest pro-democracy political organization in the country.
President Obama mentions you in that way. No pressure or anything, right?
Look, I was a politician trying to climb the ladder, right? So
sure, I
was flattered and excited, and mostly I was like, "Well, this seems good for me," And the other piece was like, dude remains my political hero. So between that and then getting to spend some time with him in the year or two that followed, that meant a lot to me.
One of the other things after the 2016, you were busy after the 2016 election between Let America Vote, but you also started the podcast Majority 54. What was it that inspired you to start that and now keep it going as you're entering the, fifth year of it?
Yeah, well, I was going around the country for Let America Vote, and because by 2018 I was pretty seriously looking at running for president. I was getting ready to run for president, and so I was like in 47 states inside of a year. And I'm doing all these events where at the end I would always take questions. And it just felt like so many of the questions were so frequently like, how do I maintain a relationship with my aunt, my best friend, whoever, who's really going down this Trump road? How do I maintain a relationship and maybe even bring them back into the fold? And so I realized a couple of things. One, people were acting as if we were this deep minority and they were really demoralized. And two, the most effective way to bring people back into what was truly the majority, the progressive majority, was through the existing relationships in their lives. Because if you are friends with somebody, you have credibility with them and they'll listen to you and care what you think and why. And so the idea, we called it Majority 54 because it was to remind people that in 2016, 54% of the country voted not for Donald Trump, but also because it was about trying to expand that majority and doing it not by being centrist or moderate, but it's really focused on how do we win in areas that seem to be going away from us? How do we not give up on the suburbs and on rural areas and on the middle and the southern part of the country? And I really, really enjoyed doing it. And it was successful. And then when I stepped back from everything in 2018, I stepped back from it for a good while, like a couple of years, a year and a half or so. And then after a while, I started to do a lot better, and I wasn't really doing anything in politics. I was just doing VCP, Veterans Community Project. And I thought, I think I would like to do that again. And I went through a few months of I'd like to do it again. And I started talking to the network I'd been at before, and we were planning things out, but timing wise, it wasn't going to work. And also I didn't really have the hunger like I did before. And, but my friend, Ravi Gupta, and I, he's been a political organizer all through, red states and that kind of thing. We were talking on the phone a fair amount and having interesting conversations. And Ravi's also a real world beater of a guy. He's always doing fascinating things and he's really good at it. And he also has no kids. And so he's got time. And I was like, hey man, I would bring back Majority 54 if you wanted to co-host. And like, so I didn't have the whole, workload on me. And he was like, absolutely. So in like June of 20, I think we brought it back. And yeah, it's been awesome. It's been really fun and really successful. So.
Well, it was definitely fun seeing it all of a sudden pop back up in my feed because I don't like unsubscribe. It's, things just start showing up in my podcast app. So it was nice to see that back again. You've referred to yourself, or you've referred to sort of politics and you as a politician sort of in past tense a little bit there, and you see politicians write their memoirs when they're done with public office. You've got it, the memoir coming out. And I know this is a question a lot of people are wondering, particularly a very good friend of mine in the St. Louis area who voted for you in 2016. Do you see yourself being on a ballot again anytime soon?
Maybe. The big difference in my life now is I don't think about the future all the time because I'm enjoying the present. And so if you could wave a magic wand right now and make me a U.S. Senator, I'd be like, no, thanks, because I prefer the job I have. And so, and like I'm coaching Little League and I'm playing baseball. Like I play on a over 30 wood bat team and I really enjoy it. And I work out 6 days a week and my wife's career is going great. And I have these 2 kids and I drop off my son at school every morning and I pick him up, at 3:00 every day. And in between I work. So my life is like right where I want it right now. But the other thing is I'm still involved, right? I mean, like in a myriad different ways, I have the luxury of if there's something that I want said politically that's not being said, or if I want to get involved with a campaign here and there and that kind of thing, I can. And it's a huge luxury, right? Like, I mean, because I have a platform. And so I don't think that you have to be a candidate to be considered in politics. So yeah, maybe one day I will. I don't rule it out at all. Right now, it does not interest me at all because it's like any other job, right? I mean, when you are considering taking a new job, you think about whether you like it better than the job you have. And I'm in the best civilian job I've ever had. So, and I get to do my podcast and when I have something I really want to say, I can usually, go on CNN or MSNBC or whatever and say it. So, but I usually don't because that's usually around dinner time. I either am having dinner with my family or we have a Little League game or I have a baseball game. Like I had not long ago, last summer, there was a time when I don't remember what they wanted me to come on and talk about, but Chris Hayes' show reached out and they were like, and I like Chris and I've done that show a few times and they were like, hey, will you come on? And I was like, I have a baseball game tonight that I'm playing in. And they're like, okay. I was like, so I can't. And then Chris actually texted me, like, cause his booker must have told him. And Chris texted me later and was like, hey, solid decision, right on. Like, so
and Chris is a baseball fan. He's a noted Cubs fan.
Cubs fan,
a huge Cub fan. Like he understands.
Yeah. So like, I'm having too much fun, I guess is the answer. But one day maybe. I don't have any plans to do that.
Excellent. Well, good for you. Last question, and we'll let you get out of here because I know you got a few hours of time before you got to go do school pickup. What do you love about the Kansas City Jewish community?
I think it's a good question. I think, one, I'm related to half of it. But two, I think what I love about the Kansas City Jewish community, because being involved in national politics, I've had the opportunity to travel around and to spend time in the Jewish community in a lot of other cities. And I guess to me, what separates us is I feel like there is a really unified tikkun olam activism ethic throughout the Jewish community here that you find in other places too. But I think what's unique about it here is I've never done anything with another member of the Jewish community here where we've had a conversation that lasted more than a few seconds about like which temple they were from or or even like which, denomination of Judaism, whether they were Reform, which, any of that, right? Like, and I do think that is a little bit unique. Like there are issues that come up, political issues that come up occasionally that I've noticed that in the larger political Jewish community, for instance, nationally, there are sometimes issues where both sides of the issue within the Jewish world tend to want to treat it as a litmus test as to how quote unquote good of a Jew you are, and, sometimes they usually have to do with Israel. And I don't detect that here hardly at all. I never have. And that's really interesting to me. And it's something I value a lot. It's just that the Jewish community here is really dedicated to making Kansas City and the whole community a better place, and is deeply rooted here in a special way.
Well, Jason Kander, thank you so much for all of your time. I definitely could have done a whole other episode with you just on, baseball and whatnot.
Sure,
I'm glad maybe some other time. I'm glad we brought it back to this. But best of luck with Veterans Community Project. We're very excited to see where it expands to next. And thank you so much for all your time today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
The Getting to Know Jew podcast is a product of the Kansas City Jewish Chronicle and the Jewish Federation of Greater Kansas City. It is part of the Jewfolk Podcast Network and produced by Jewfolk Inc. Please rate, review, subscribe, and share. If you have suggestions for future guests, please email the show at webmaster@jewishkc.org.